Early in the summer, earlier in the summer, I questioned the Trent Frederic extension, but after a little digging, I might eat my words. Today, we're reevaluating Frederick and why my perspective has evolved.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This upcoming October will be my fourth season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every day. Today's edition of Locked On Oilers is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, like you heard in that cold open, our episode today will entirely be a reevaluation of Trent Frederic. We will do it through three specific lenses. We will do historical context and pedigree, how he was used in Boston, what the expectations were based on how he was used. Our second segment, we will pivot to looking at the underlying numbers. We'll talk about scoring chances, expected goals, the relation to the tangible counting stats results those produced. And then in our final segment, we will hone in on why the Oilers made the calculated risk they did, what I think Stan Bowman sees in Frederick, and why I am a little more, maybe I would say, optimistic about this transaction, at least in the short term, than I was earlier in the summer. So to start things out, and my everydayers who have been with me for a while now know I'm a big believer that you need context. When we are talking about team sports, one player, and in hockey, we're talking about 18 skaters and 2 goalies. We're talking about 18 total players throughout the course of the game, that we need to understand their role, their assignment, what the expectations are based on that. We need to compare the results versus the expectation. We need to talk about the organization's overall trajectory. And that's where I would like to start this Frederic conversation. So, face value, when you look at Trent Frederic's hockey DB, it's kind of underwhelming. Frederic is 27 years old, and he has 338 career NHL games played. That's not a lot. And yet, when you look at Frederic's draft class, that 2016 draft class, he's got a lot of games played in relation to a lot. Now, the upper echelon of that class, which includes Matthew Tkachuk, Austin Matthews, Clayton Keller, Alex DeBrincat, Sergachev, Pierre-Luc Dubois, Jacob Chikrin, Charlie McAvoy, Patrick Laine, amongst many others. This is a pretty good class when you talk about just the results. Frederic's got 338 games played. That puts him in the top 20 of players from his draft class. And of course, games played are not a great barometer for how good a player is. There are plenty of guys who hang around. You know, there's that one quote, there's that one tweet I have to paraphrase because we're not allowed to swear on the Locked On Podcast Network. But you know, if a player is referred to as a former first round pick, they are turbo dog poop. That is paraphrasing, of course, but when a player's most enticing pitch, when an analyst, an insider, someone is attributing a qualifier, a descriptor to that player, you know, they do a comma, Trent Frederic, comma, former first round pick, that is not the most ringing endorsement, because if the player had an accolade, an accomplishment, it would be attributed to them. You know, if it was Stanley Cup, Trent Frederic, Stanley Cup champion, Trent Frederic, former 60-point scorer, 30-goal scorer, Trent Frederic, former league leader in penalty minutes. If there was something other than his draft status to attribute to him, he would get that qualifier. So that's why we got to start with the context, because you think about where Frederic was drafted and when. So you think about the Bruins in the context of the last 15 years or so. They start that last decade. They win the Stanley Cup in 2011 against the Vancouver Canucks. They make the finals again in 2013, where they lose to the Blackhawks, even though they had a 1-goal lead with less than 2 minutes to go. They could have forced a game 7 there. They get back to the Stanley Cup final in 2019 and lose to the St. Louis Blues in one of the bigger upsets as far as talent disparity of the last 10 to 15 years in the Stanley Cup final. They set the record for points in a season in the present format a couple years ago. They have Linus Ullmark win the Vezina Trophy when Jeremy Swayman had better numbers. That's how good that team was that season. And then the wheels come off last year. But we use that big picture drop down because it's important to understand why Trent Frederic doesn't have as many games played, why he's never played a particularly large role. When you go and look at the numbers, this is a guy whose career averaging games is 12 and a half minutes. 12 and a half minutes per game. Somebody who almost all of his ice time has come against opponents' bottom six forwards. There's not a lot to go on here. And we're talking about somebody who is in what is supposed to be the prime of their NHL career. We typically would say an NHL player's peak production is going to be ages 28, 29, 30. Because by that point, you have built enough of a track record, enough of a sample size that a team is going to take a chance on you. When you get that one big contract you get, if you sign that long-term deal at 27 or 28, the way Frederick has, you typically have some sense of a proven track record. And then once a team gives you money, and long-term money at that, they are inherently invested in you having a breakthrough and you putting up good counting stats. That's why there's a direct correlation and why, as my everydayers know, ice time is the single biggest indicator of eventual counting stat success. And Trent Frederic, if you're only playing 12 and a half minutes per game, you aren't going to have a path to a lot of counting stats. Somebody who's 25, 30 seconds a game on the power play, if that, a second unit in Boston, somebody who plays a lot of defense first minutes in Boston, a lot of time alongside guys like Charlie Coyle. And look, there is a utility in defense first forwards. I'm not disputing that. I think when you get guys in this archetype, the strong forechecker, effective off the cycle, offensive upside, willing to fight when need be, though I don't think fighting is particularly a useful trait anymore. I think when you look at the archetype and you look at the skill set, you understand why the Bruins brought him along so slowly. The Bruins were, they won the second most games of any team in the entire NHL over the last 7 years. And that includes last year where they finished last in the Atlantic Division. The second most games, the only team with more wins during that period of time since 2018, the Tampa Bay Lightning. Consistent Stanley Cup contenders. What do we always say about Stanley Cup contenders here on the show? The Oilers, this applies to as well. We talked about this in the context of Dylan Holloway, Philip Broberg. We're going to be talking about it this upcoming season in the context of Matthew Savoie and Ike Howard. Contenders don't give young guys opportunities. The Bruins, plenty of talent. Pasternak, Marchand, DeBrusk, so many guys blocking Frederic's path to serious NHL ice time. And that's really one of the keys. You think about Pasternak, Brad Marchand, Taylor Hall, Craig Smith, Eric Haula, Jake DeBrusk, all guys who were more important in the pecking order at various stages during Trent Frederic's tenure in Boston, blocking him from getting a bigger role. So when you are reduced, when you don't have those opportunities to build up your traits, to maybe perhaps build up your confidence, you get a little more pigeonholed. Your skill set, your specialization, it becomes a bit more refined. You are asked to do a very specific role. And Trent Frederic, in this case, in Boston, does a very specific role. He is in those defense first assignments where his job is to absorb pressure when they get defensive zone starts, to not give up good scoring chances. And then when they do have possession, get the puck down to the other end, forecheck those defenders, try and force them into mistakes so the Bruins can sustain offensive zone time. And then once they're in the offensive zone, you have a little bit of offensive upside. He does have the 1 point per game season at Wisconsin, though I don't think college hockey's counting stats are particularly helpful or useful when we're determining how good an NHL player is ultimately going to be. I think I understand what the vision is here. And when we talk about the shot metrics in the upcoming segment, you're going to get a deeper understanding. Because as we're about to talk about, the numbers bear out. Trent Frederic, at least when he was with Boston, the Bruins did a decent job of maintaining possession in the offensive zone and limiting chances against. Coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Have you ever decided last minute to head to a game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day and suddenly that itch starts to hit you. That's exactly where our friends at Game Time come in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without any of the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge. Maybe another drink, maybe going for the bigger size portion of food, jersey, a hat, or maybe you even invite more people to go to the game with you. Game Time makes it happen. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app drop the closer you get to first pitch. They've got incredible last minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB. It makes it easy to browse the app for any MLB game. I'm definitely trying to get to a handful more Met games before the regular season's over, in spite of how poorly they've played for much of August and July. Most importantly, my favorite part of the Game Time ticket experience is the panoramic seat view in the app. So you know the view of the game you're getting before you get to the stadium. If you're ready to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, you need to download the Game Time app today. Create an account. Use code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON NHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. So glad to be back. I had a great time on my trip. My vacation was incredible. I am getting ready, ramping up for the season to start. I know we're still more than a month away from the start of the NHL regular season, but I feel very refreshed. I feel mentally recharged as far as content goes and knowing what I want to do, where I want to go, the stories, the analysis I want to provide. So I'm very glad to be back. I'm very glad to be doing this episode. And I was going through, I'll just be very transparent with you. I was on the flight back on Wednesday and I was just listing out questions I had about the Oilers. As many questions as I could come up with, because that's how I like to come up with episode ideas. I like to ask questions that I don't know the answer to. And then I go and look at the data. I go through the research. And look, in the regular season, when there are games, yes, I have a lot more resources I can pour through because I can come up with questions. I can hone in on something specific. So let's say, for instance, we were going to do this Trent Frederic episode in December. We would start with the drop down. Has he had a jump in ice time? Who is he playing with? What are the associated responsibilities with where he is in the lineup? All of that. And then we'd watch the games. We would look, is he getting in on the forecheck? Is he forcing turnovers? Is he getting the puck to dangerous areas? Is he helping facilitate dangerous chance creation? When we have games to watch, we can actually test our hypothesis. It's like, if you remember science lab back in school, you get a experiment. You make a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you collect the data, and then you compare the two and you draw conclusions. That's the process we like to use here on Locked On Oilers for player evaluation. So, being that we only have the data to pour through right now because there isn't hockey in August, there is a very clear picture here. We started out last segment talking about the context. What's he being used for? Who's he playing with? What's he being asked to do? So, in the collection of said research, one of the things we looked up was who are his most common line mates and what were the quality of competition. So his first NHL season, Craig Smith, Charlie Coyle, Chris Wagner. Craig Smith, Charlie Coyle, Thomas Nosek the next season. Taylor Hall, Charlie Coyle, Pavel Zacha. James Van Riemsdyk, Charlie Coyle, Morgan Geekie. Last year, Charlie Coyle, Mark Kolesnik, Oliver Wahlstrom, Justin Brazeau. All of that in rapid succession tells me this is a player who was stuck in the middle six and towards the end of his tenure in Boston got a little more opportunity because the Bruins were desperate. You fire Jim Montgomery, you make your interim coach, you try anything, you're throwing anything at the wall in hopes you can salvage your season. And Frederick ultimately gets traded. And when you look at the shot metrics, and I'm going to read out the broad conclusions, not the numbers by numbers, because that isn't as helpful. Trent Frederic has never had a season with a positive share of scoring chances. He has 2 seasons with positive shares of shots on goal, 3 seasons of positive goal shares, 4 seasons of positive expected goal shares, 4 seasons of positive high danger chances, 1 above average season of on ice shooting percentage, and 5 seasons of above average save percentage. So what does that all mean? So if a player is conceding more scoring chances, and remember, scoring chances, shots on goal, 2 different things. Shots on goal are only ones that are on net, not ones that miss, not ones that get blocked. So if a team has more scoring chances, there is an associated assumption that that team is going to have a greater chance of scoring, because the more scoring chances you generate, the more likely they are to become shots on goal. The more shots on goal you generate, the more likely you are to eventually score. But what these numbers bear out, and what these numbers tell us, at least on a face value level, the Bruins were outchanced when Frederick was on the ice, which correlates with a defense-first mindset. That means that when Trent Frederic, Charlie Coyle, and whomever else, Coyle being his most common lineman during his Boston tenure, they were out there to bring the temperature of the game down, to hold the other team to the outside. You know, Frederick, tall, long reach, somebody who in theory should be a pretty good shot suppressor, someone who can use that size, can use that reach to keep opponents to the outside. And if players are kept to the outside, more things can happen with that puck on the way. You force a more difficult shot, they miss the net outright. You block it, you give your goalie a better chance. So with those, we go to the next tier. So if the Bruins are getting shots on goal, but not as many scoring chances, that's telling you they're doing more. They're getting the puck into the offensive zone. And where Frederick has, I think, surplus value, and where his skill set in particular is useful, is on the forecheck. And we know last year in the playoffs, as the postseason went along, the Oilers' forecheck started to dissipate. And forechecking, very similar to defense, starts to become a battle of attrition. Do you have the energy to consistently go that length of the ice? You know, whether it's the 110 feet from the halfway line in all the way down to the blue line all the way down. It accumulates, it adds up, and fatigue is real. Playing a dump and chase, grind it out style is not the most efficient form of hockey. My everydayers have heard me talk about that a lot. The reason Connor McDavid is the best player in the world is because he's a one-man offense. He can carry the puck into the offensive zone, he can beat all the defenders, he can drive the net, and he can beat the goalie. The more variables you introduce into needing a scoring play, the more difficult it is to score. And that's also why it's not a surprise to see Frederick having that below average on-ice shooting percentage. So on-ice shooting percentage is when you add up all of the shots on goal when Trent Frederick's on the ice, not just by Trent Frederic, but by his line mates and by the defensemen that are out there. You add up all those shots on goal, and then divide that by the number of goals they scored on said shots on goal. So when they're talking 5-6% and that league average is close to 10, that's telling you they have the puck a whole lot, but they're not scoring it. Even though they have a good share of high danger chances and expected goals, that tells you the value of this group, and in that case for Boston, was zone time. If you have Frederick, you have Coyle, sometimes a little more offensive upside guys like Pavel Zacha, Taylor Hall, you get the puck in the offensive zone, you're bringing the temperature of the game down. That is the most effective type of defense first forward. Now, of course, you want to get more offense, and frankly, where I think Trent Frederic has the most value to provide to the Oilers is probably a little bit more of untapped offensive upside, especially if he were to play alongside a McDavid or a Draisaitl for an extended period of time. But purely from a statistics standpoint, there is value in what Trent Frederic provides. Now, how much of that is him versus Coyle versus the Bruins system versus the quality of the team overall? That's a fair question, because the Bruins are such a good team for such a long time. They have a lot of games where they have a lead late. They have above average goaltending, whether that's Tuukka Rask, whether that's Jeremy Swayman, Linus Ullmark, etc. All of those factors make it a little harder to distill out how much of that is Trent Frederic being good versus Trent Frederic having the adaptability to play well in a favorable situation. So with all of that said, we're going to take our second and final break. And then I'm going to tell you why I think the offensive upside probably is there for Trent Frederic and why Stan Bowman took the risk he did and giving the forward such a long extension coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. August 26th is officially FanDuel Futures Day, a brand new holiday for football fans who live for bold predictions and preseason hunches. For just 24 hours, FanDuel is giving you deals on NFL season predictions. So whether you're calling MVP, eyeing a long shot division winner, or you think you know who's going to win the Super Bowl before week one kicks off, this is your shot. If you're like me, you like to look at the darts. When it comes to futures, when it comes to something I'm going to be watching all season long, I want to give myself something that's going to be fun to root for and something that has a ton of value. For me, I am looking at narratives. I am looking at upside. Number one, CJ Stroud for MVP. If the Texans come off of last year and bounce back and Stroud throws for 4,000, 4,500 yards, the Texans win 11 or 12 games, maybe look like a bona fide Super Bowl contender, the narrative's there. Another one I really like. This is a sneaky one, and this is one of my guys. The Clemson jerseys over there on the other side of my room. Trevor Lawrence, real long shot. And I know what you're thinking. Nick, he's overrated. He is going to be in an offense schemed by Liam Cohen, who made Baker Mayfield a fringe MVP candidate. He's going to be throwing to Travis Hunter and Brian Thomas. They are going to have a totally revamped running game. The Jaguars have upside. Maybe they're the team that surprises everyone, wins the AFC South, and looks like a bona fide Super Bowl contender. There are so many opportunities. So visit the FanDuel app today and start planning those futures bets now, because futures bets is one day and one day only. FanDuel, play your game. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. And I love doing these. I'm just going to be frank. These are my favorite format of episodes to do, because they marry everything I find interesting about hockey. Because so much of a player's value gets distilled out into a handful of numbers. How many goals do they contribute on? How much ice time do they get? Do they need the power play to be counting stat productive? What was their path to get here? And that, for me, is where I want to start this final segment and why I think there might be more here for Frederick. At 27, most NHL players are pretty defined in what they are. They have been drafted 8-9 years prior. 8 or 9 years in the context of a hockey career is an eternity. 8 or 9, most NHL players don't get to a third or fourth or a fifth season if they haven't shown something. And look, Trent Frederic had a lot of the benefit of the doubt of some of the stuff I talked about at the end of the last segment. Good team, low stakes for him because he's playing low in the lineup, not expected to do a whole lot, but that changes your trajectory. And look, this type of archetype, the high end version of this is a 50 to 60 point guy, maybe 25 and 25, 30, 30. That's the absolute highest end range outcome here for Trent Frederic. He has a low end version of a Zach Hyman year. He can be a 50 to 60 point forward, 20 to 30 goals, can chip in a little bit on your second power play, but he lacks the dynamic skating. He lacks the dynamic hands. He lacks the dynamic playmaking. You can get through a lot as a high work rate player. Someone like a Ryan Callahan carved out a really good NHL career by outworking everybody else, by having the highest end motor possible and hitting everything that moved. You can do a lot with that skill set. And Frederick, by virtue of being tall, by virtue of having a lot of mass on him, has those traits that NHL GMs are willing to take chances on. And the old saying, this is why centers go so high in basketball. You can't teach size. Frederick's size has afforded him a lot of opportunities in the NHL. I don't think the Oilers were saying, let's find a 6'2 guy and hope he's good. I think there is a realistic path to Trent Frederic putting up an inefficient, but a counting stat value season. I think there's a world where Trent Frederic can put up 50, 55 points. We can all nod and say, okay, it's not going to be very efficient. And that's really where the question comes in for me. He has two good shooting seasons. He has a season of 14.6 and a season of 14.2. those are also the two best seasons of his NHL career, the seasons where he had 31 and 40 points respectively. The second one, the 23-24 season 2 years ago now in NHL context, 1345, the most minutes he's ever played in a season, on average in a season, also being the highest point total in his career to that point. And he didn't do it because he had a massive jump in power play time. He went from 3 seconds the year prior to 20. Most of that offense coming at even strength shows you there's something there. And I think there is a path for Trent Frederic to effectively fill in the Evander Kane role from 2 or 3 years ago here. He can be the supplementary pain in the butt. Now, he's not going to drive a line. He is not going to make offense for himself or for others. He is purely going to be a retriever, a forechecker, and right place, right time guy. The shooting traits are decent. You go look at the NHL edge stats. He's got an above average shot in terms of speed. Now, he doesn't score a ton of goals. His career average in a season, and look, I understand those first 2 seasons where he played 16, 17 total games skew these numbers. But we're talking about someone who does not score a lot. We're talking about somebody who best case scenario is probably 20 goals. And look, even if you want to give him the benefit of the doubt and say, well, he's going to play with McDavid, he's going to play with Draisaitl. He never played with Pasta or Bergeron for an extended period of time at Boston. Sure, I'll give you that. The best case scenario for Trent Frederic is probably 25 goals. I do not see a world where Trent Frederic can do more than that without something unforeseen. If that's power play one time, if that's an emergence or a jump. And look, some guys do that. Chris Kreider didn't hit 30 goals until his 10th NHL season. He hit 54. Now, I'm not saying Trent Frederic's going to score 50 goals. You could look at someone like Brock Nelson of the New York Islanders, who didn't really get going counting stats-wise until his early 30s. I'm not saying Trent Frederic is going to have one of those late bloomer trajectories. I think there is a world where he plays a reasonable role on a decent team. And I think the Oilers, if we go by what we know about Chris Knoblauch, I think he wants somebody like this in the top 6. And I think losing Evander Kane, and look, Kane's got a lot of miles, the injuries, he's a bit of a nuisance, pain in the butt to deal with. Make no mistake about it. That's 30 goals, 25 goals you're losing there in trading away Evander Kane for cap relief. I don't think, of course, and we talked about this all summer long, the everydayers have heard me game out the math of replacing goals here with positive regression. And what do you get from Howard? What do you get from Savoie? What do you get from Mangiapane? I think if you put Trent Frederic in effectively the Podkolzin role from last year, where he plays a lot with Draisaitl, we don't know who's going to be on the right there. It could be a few different guys. If you put him there, I think there's a path for him to be a 20-goal guy. And if you get 20 goals out of Trent Frederic at the $3.8 million he signed for, I can live with that. That's reasonable. Now, how that grades out in the long term, I think that is where how the Trent Frederic extension ages is the major source of consternation. And I understand that. $3.8 million against the cap that's at 95.5, that'll be 104, 114, very short order, isn't a whole lot. But it's money that could be spent elsewhere, and that's the source of a lot of the frustration here. Why are the Oilers paying for something that Trent Frederic has never done, score 20 goals? The Oilers think that with his ability and hopefully some improved health, last year his slowest on record season skate speed wise, average top skate speed wise, you deal with a lower body injury. The further removed you get from it, the healthier you hope he is, the better his skating is, the more he's able to provide. I'm not saying he's going to be Zach Hyman, but I do think there's a world where he could be a pretty useful player on a team that needs useful hockey players. That'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I want to thank everyone that made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your teams covered every day. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new episodes go live. I will talk to you guys on Monday. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. Be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night, where they're previewing all 32 teams ahead of the 2025-2026 NHL season.